The smell of bay rum and hot lather couldn't mask the scent of impending death. 5 men, heavy with iron and bad intentions, kicked open the door of the Silver City Barbershop. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards, glinting off drawn colts. The barber's hand trembled, the straight razor hovering over his client's throat. But the old man in the chair didn't even open his eyes. He just sighed, settling deeper into the leather. "Finish the shave," he rumbled. "I'll handle them." Silver City, New Mexico territory, was not a place where men went to live. It was a place they went to hide, to sweat, and eventually to die. The year was 1881, and the August heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the tin roofs and turning the dusty streets into a shimmering mirage of cracked earth. Inside Christian Vance's barbershop, the heat was stifling, thick with the aromas of witch hazel, stale cigar smoke, and the heavy, sweet scent of shaving soap. Christian was a man out of his element. He had learned his trade in the civilized parlors of Philadelphia, snipping the manicured hair of bankers and politicians. He had moved west, hoping the dry air would cure his wife's consumption, a dream that had died with her 2 years prior. Now he was left with a pair of shears, a leather strop, and a clientele that usually smelled of horse sweat and cheap whiskey. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the town was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of a man's neck stand up. The swinging doors of the saloon across the street were still. The stray dogs had crawled under the boardwalks to pant in the shade. The bell above Christian's door jingled, shattering the heavy silence. The man who walked in seemed to bring the dust and the silence with him. He was tall, stooped slightly at the shoulders with age, but his movements possessed a deliberate, coiled grace. A worn duster swept the floorboards around his scarred leather boots. A low-crowned Stetson shadowed his face, but Christian could see the deep ravines of wrinkles etching his cheeks, skin cured by decades of unforgiving sun. His beard was a bristly mix of iron gray and stark white, but it was the man's eyes that made Christian pause in the middle of sweeping the floor. They were a pale, washed-out blue, like the sky right before a winter blizzard. They took in the entire room in a fraction of a second, the back door, the windows, the shadows in the corners, before settling on the empty barber chair. Without a word, the stranger unbuckled his gun belt. The leather was supple, darkened with age and oil. He didn't just carry a standard peacemaker. He wore a matched pair of heavy Colt Dragoons, modified and worn smooth from a lifetime of drawing. He laid the rig on the marble counter next to Christian's combs. The thud of the heavy iron against the stone sounded like a gavel falling in a silent courtroom. The man took off his duster, revealing a faded chambray shirt, and sat in the large leather chair. He tilted his head back, resting it against the headrest, and closed those chilling blue eyes. "Shave" was the only word he spoke. His voice sounded like 2 pieces of rough granite grinding together. Christian swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. Right away." Christian went to work, finding a strange comfort in the familiar routine. He pumped the hot water, soaking a pristine white towel. He approached the old man carefully, as if approaching a sleeping mountain lion, and wrapped the scalding towel around the lower half of the stranger's face to soften the bristles. The man didn't flinch at the heat. While the towel did its work, Christian took his favorite straight razor, a Sheffield steel blade with a bone handle, and began to work it back and forth across the leather strop hanging from the arm of the chair. Slap, swish, slap, swish. The rhythmic sound usually calmed Christian, but today his heart was beating an uneven tattoo against his ribs. There was a heaviness in the air, a barometric drop that signaled a storm, though the sky outside was a relentless, cloudless blue. He removed the towel and began to whip up the lather in his shaving mug, using a badger hair brush. As he painted the thick, warm foam onto the old man's weathered cheeks and throat, the street outside began to change. It started as a low rumble, felt in the floorboards before it was heard, the sound of hooves, not the chaotic clatter of a stagecoach or a lone rider, but the synchronized, deliberate pacing of several horses moving together. Christian paused, the brush hovering mid-air, and glanced out the large, dust-streaked front window. At the far end of the street, riding 5 abreast, a group of men had appeared through the shimmering heat haze. They rode slow, letting their horses walk, projecting an arrogance that belonged only to men who considered themselves above the law. As they drew closer, the meager foot traffic on the street simply vanished. A woman pulled her child into the general store and slammed the door. The blacksmith stopped hammering. The town held its breath. Christian's blood turned to ice water. He recognized the man riding point. Jeb Rollins. Rollins was a name used to frighten children in the territory. He was a ruthless, cold-eyed killer who ran a gang of outlaws and rustlers out of the Chino Valley. He was wearing a dark frock coat despite the heat, a silver concho band around his hat, and a sneer that promised violence. "Don't stop!" the voice rumbled from the chair. Christian jolted. The old man hadn't opened his eyes, hadn't moved a muscle, but he knew Christian had stopped working. "Sir, Christian stammered, his voice cracking. "That's Jeb Rollins out there. He ain't a man to cross paths with." "I know exactly who he is," the old man said, his tone utterly devoid of concern. "Lather the neck. It's getting dry." Christian's hands shook as he applied more foam. He looked out the window again. The 5 riders were pulling their mounts to a halt right in front of his shop. The dust swirled around the horse's legs, settling onto the wooden boardwalk. Christian picked up the straight razor, opening the blade. His knuckles were white. The 5 men were dismounting. The jingle of their silver spurs sounded like a death knell in the oppressive quiet of the afternoon. The 5 men tied their horses to the rail outside the barbershop with maddening slowness. It was a calculated display of power. They were in no rush. They owned this moment, and they owned this town. Through the glass, Christian watched them. Behind Jeb Rollins stood Cletus McCoy, a massive brute of a man with a wild, tangled red beard and a shotgun resting casually over his massive shoulder. McCoy was known for tearing a man's ear off in a saloon brawl in Prescott. Next to him was Hiram Galt, a skinny, twitchy man with pockmarked cheeks and 2 ivory-handled revolvers slung low on his hips. Galt had a reputation for shooting first and never bothering to ask questions at all. Flanking them were Billy Travers and Emmett Callahan, 2 younger, hard-eyed gunmen who desperately wanted to make names for themselves, the kind of men who killed just to prove they had the nerve. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the boardwalk, their boots planted on the wooden planks. Jeb Rollins spit a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt, wiped his mouth with the back of a gloved hand, and looked directly through the barbershop window. Christian felt his stomach bottom out. The razor in his hand felt impossibly heavy. He had the blade pressed lightly against the old man's jawline, right over the jugular. If he flinched now, he would bleed the man out right in the chair. Clack, clack, clack. The heavy footsteps sounded on the boardwalk. Rollins stepped up to the door. The bell jingled merrily, a sickening contrast to the malice entering the room. The door swung inward, hitting the wall with a dull thud. The 5 men filled the doorway, blocking out the harsh afternoon sun, casting long, menacing shadows across the barbershop floor. The air inside instantly grew thicker, contaminated by the smell of unwashed bodies, leather, stale whiskey, and gun oil. Christian froze. He couldn't breathe. The razor rested motionless against the stark white lather on the old man's throat. Rollins stepped into the room, his spurs dragging slightly. He took off his hat, revealing slicked-back dark hair, and let his eyes roam the shop. He ignored the terrified barber and looked at the heavy Colt dragoons resting on the marble counter. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well now," Rollins drawled, his voice a smooth, oily tenor that belied the violence he was capable of. "I'll be damned. The boys and I have been riding for 3 days, eating dust and chewing on saddle leather, looking for a ghost, and here I find him sitting in a parlor, getting primped like a fancy lady." The old man in the chair did not move. His eyes remained shut. His breathing was slow and even, lifting the barber cloth draped over his chest in a steady rhythm. Cletus McCoy let out a low, rumbling laugh, shifting the shotgun on his shoulder. Don't look so tough without them big irons in his hands, does he, Jeb?" "Careful, Cletus," Rollins mocked gently, taking another step into the room, fanning out so his men could enter behind him. "You're looking at a legend, a myth. The man who supposedly shot down the entire Miller gang in Abilene before they could even clear leather. Rollins scoffed, a dry, ugly sound. Looks just like a tired old man to me. Christian stood paralyzed. His eyes darted from the razor in his hand to the 5 heavily armed men spreading out in his small shop. Hiram Galt moved to the left, his hand resting inches from the butt of his right revolver, his twitchy eyes scanning the room. The 2 younger men, Travers and Callahan, stepped to the right, blocking the back exit. They had the room completely boxed in. "Barber!" Rollins said, his eyes snapping to Christian. The gaze was like a physical blow. "Put the blade down and step back. We have private business with your customer." Christian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His mind screamed at him to drop the razor, to run, to beg for his life. But his muscles were locked. He was trapped in a nightmare, standing between a pack of wolves and their prey. "I said," Rollins' voice lost its mocking tone, dropping an octave into a deadly growl, "drop the razor." Galt's hand hovered over his gun. The air in the room was pulled taut, like a piano wire about to snap. Christian felt a bead of sweat roll down his forehead and sting his eye. He slowly began to pull the razor away from the old man's neck, intending to place it on the counter, intending to step away and let these men do whatever bloody work they had come to do. But before the blade could leave the skin, a rough, calloused hand shot out from beneath the barber cloth. The old man's hand gripped Christian's wrist with the strength of a steel vise. The grip was immovable, anchoring Christian's hand in place, keeping the razor exactly where it was, pressed lightly against the lathered throat. For the first time since he sat down, the old man opened his eyes. They weren't looking at Rollins. They weren't looking at the 5 armed men. They were looking straight up into the ceiling, calm, unbothered, and entirely awake. The old man's voice broke the silence, not with a shout, but with a low, resonating command that cut through the tension in the room like a physical blade. "Finish the shave," he said. "I'll handle them." The sheer audacity of the command caused a ripple of confusion among the outlaws. Galt blinked, his hand pausing over his gun. Cletus let out a baffled grunt. Even Jeb Rollins frowned, his oily smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Christian's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might shatter them. The old man's grip on his wrist was unrelenting, forcing the razor to stay positioned. Christian stared down into those washed-out blue eyes. There was no fear in them. There was no bravado either. There was only a cold, terrifying certainty. "Sir, they," Christian whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "There's 5 of them." "I can count, son," the old man murmured, releasing Christian's wrist and sliding his hand back under the white cloth. "Use short strokes. Go with the grain. I don't want razor burn." Rollins recovered his composure, his face flushing dark with sudden rage. "You arrogant old bastard," he hissed. "You think you're still in your prime? You think you're going to talk your way out of this? You ain't wearing your irons. You're sitting in a chair with a blade to your throat and you're surrounded." The old man finally turned his head, but he didn't look back at Rollins. Instead, he looked straight ahead, into the large silver-backed mirror mounted on the wall opposite the door. From the angle of the chair, the mirror provided a perfect panoramic view of the entire barbershop behind him. "Jebediah Rollins," the old man said, speaking to the reflection in the glass. "Born in Tennessee, ran out of Missouri for stealing horses, burned a church in Kansas because the preacher wouldn't hand over the collection plate." Rollins stiffened. "Shut your mouth." "That big dumb animal on your left," the old man continued, his voice steady, ignoring the command entirely, "is Cletus McCoy. I recognize the stench. Cletus, I heard your brother hung from a cottonwood in Texas, cried for his mother the whole way up." Cletus roared, bringing the barrel of the shotgun down, pointing it squarely at the back of the chair. "I'll blow your head clean off your shoulders." "Hold on, Cletus," Rollins snapped, holding up a hand. Rollins wanted the satisfaction of the kill, wanted to break the legend before he put a bullet in him. "Let the old man talk. Let him dig his grave." The old man's eyes shifted in the mirror, tracking the movements of the men. "The twitchy one on the right is Galt, a coward who shoots men in the back when they're drunk. The other 2, just boys, meat for the grinder, boys who think dying in the dirt makes them men." "You're a dead man talking," Galt snarled, drawing his right gun halfway out of the holster. "Keep shaving, Christian," the old man commanded, his eyes locked on the mirror. Christian, driven by a primal instinct to obey the calmest voice in the room, swallowed his terror. His hand was shaking so badly he had to grip his right wrist with his left hand to steady it. He touched the blade to the old man's cheek and made a short, scraping stroke, pulling away the white foam and leaving a strip of smooth, tanned skin. Scrape. The sound was shockingly loud in the tense silence of the room. "That's right," the old man said softly. "Nice and easy." Rollins drew his Colt. The metallic snick of the hammer being pulled back echoed off the tin ceiling. It was the sound of a death sentence being finalized. "You killed my cousin Eli down in Tombstone," Rollins said, his voice dropping the mocking facade, revealing the raw, ugly hatred underneath. "Shot him in the street like a dog. We've tracked you for 3 months for this." "Eli drew first," the old man said calmly, his eyes watching Rollins's reflection. "And he was slow, just like you're going to be." "I ain't drawing against you," Rollins sneered, leveling his gun at the back of the old man's head. "I'm executing you, right here, and this barber's gonna clean up the mess." "You're making a mistake, Jeb," the old man said. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't reach for the guns on the counter. They were 10 feet away, utterly out of reach. "The only mistake I made was not finding you sooner," Rollins said. He tightened his finger on the trigger. "No," the old man said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Your mistake is thinking I ever needed those irons on the counter to kill you." In the mirror, Christian saw the old man's eyes shift. They weren't looking at Rollins anymore. They were looking at the geometry of the room. They were calculating. "What the hell are you talking about?" Rollins demanded, a flicker of doubt finally entering his voice. "I'm talking about the fact that you boys walked into a confined space," the old man said, "and you stood exactly where I wanted you to stand." The old man shifted his eyes to Christian. "Duck." Christian didn't think. He didn't question. The tone of absolute authority triggered an automatic response. He dropped to his knees behind the heavy barber chair, pulling his head down. In the same fraction of a second, the old man moved. It was an explosion of violence so fast it defied his apparent age. The lethargy vanished, replaced by the striking speed of a rattlesnake. He didn't stand up. He didn't reach for the distant counter. Instead, the old man kicked his booted foot violently upward, striking the underside of the heavy cast-iron footrest of the barber chair. The mechanism unlocked, and the chair spun on its pedestal with a violent squeal of metal. As the chair whipped around to face the 5 men, the old man's hands flashed from beneath the white barber cloth. He wasn't unarmed. Concealed under the cloth, resting on his lap the entire time, was a shortened, double-barreled 10-gauge scattergun, its barrel sawed down to a mere 8 inches. Before the chair even stopped spinning, before Rollins could comprehend the blur of motion, before Galt could clear his leather, the old man pulled the first trigger. The roar of the 10-gauge in the enclosed barbershop was deafening, a concussive shockwave of fire, smoke, and lead that shattered the front window and blew the mirror off the wall in a shower of silver shards. The blast hit Cletus McCoy dead center, lifting the massive man off his feet and throwing him backward through the shattered glass door, his unfired shotgun clattering uselessly to the floorboards. Chaos erupted. The air was instantly choked with the acrid, sulphurous bite of black powder smoke. Galt screamed, drawing his gun, firing blindly into the smoke. The bullet chipped the marble counter. Rollins cursed, trying to bring his Colt to bear through the blinding cloud of dust and debris. But the old man wasn't in the chair anymore. Using the recoil of the shotgun and the momentum of the spin, he had launched himself sideways, rolling across the floorboards toward the far wall, disappearing into the thick cloud of gun smoke. From beneath the chair, his hands clamped over his ears, Christian heard the click of a second hammer being pulled back. The nightmare had just begun. To Christian Vance, huddled in a fetal position behind the heavy cast-iron base of the barber chair, the world had been reduced to ringing white noise and choking darkness. The discharge of a 10-gauge shotgun indoors was not just a sound, it was a physical event. The concussive wave had rattled the teeth in Christian's skull and blown out the large glass pane of the front window, sending shards raining down onto the boardwalk outside. Inside, the shop was instantly plunged into a thick, suffocating fog of black powder smoke. It smelled of sulfur, burning paper wadding, and the coppery tang of fresh blood. Somewhere in the blinding gray haze, Hiram Galt was losing his mind. "Where is he? I can't see him!" Galt shrieked. The twitchy gunman, terrified by the sudden explosion and the sight of Cletus McCoy flying backward through the door, had drawn his ivory-handled revolvers and was firing blindly into the smoke. Bang! 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 The muzzle flashes illuminated the swirling fog like miniature lightning strikes in a thundercloud. One bullet shattered a jar of blue barbicide on the counter, sending the chemical-smelling liquid splashing across the floorboards. Another tore through the tin ceiling, showering down flakes of rust and paint. "Hold your fire, you idiot!" Jeb Rollins roared, coughing violently as he waved his arm to clear the air in front of his face. "You're wasting lead!" But Galt couldn't hear him or didn't care. He fired twice more, spinning in a circle. Behind the lather station, the old man moved with the silent, terrifying grace of a phantom. He had rolled away from the chair the moment he pulled the first trigger, knowing the smoke would give him a 3-second advantage. He lay flat against the floorboards, the cool wood pressing against his chest. His breathing was slow, measured, completely unaffected by the adrenaline that was surely tearing through the younger men. He still held the sawed-off scattergun, one barrel empty, one barrel loaded with double-aught buckshot. Through the thick curtain of smoke settling near the floor, he saw a pair of scuffed brown boots creeping forward. It was Billy Travers, one of the two boys trying to earn his reputation. Travers was moving low, a Colt peacemaker trembling in his right hand, trying to flank the barber chair where he assumed the old man was still sitting. The old man didn't rise. He didn't offer a warning. He simply slid the heavy barrels of the 10-gauge across the polished floorboards, aiming just above the boy's knees. He pulled the second trigger. The second blast ripped through the shop, momentarily blowing a hole in the smoke curtain. The muzzle flash painted the room in harsh strobe light yellow. Billy Travers never even saw it coming. The buckshot caught him at thigh level, a devastating impact that lifted his legs out from under him and spun him violently in the air. He crashed hard into the wooden wall displaying Christian's tonics, bringing a shelf of glass bottles crashing down on top of him in a cascade of bay rum, witch hazel, and shattered glass. Travers hit the ground and immediately began to scream, a high, reedy, terrifying sound that cut through the ringing in the men's ears. It wasn't the sound of a hardened outlaw. It was the sound of a terrified boy who had just realized his own mortality. "My legs! Oh God, my legs!" Travers wailed, thrashing blindly on the floor, slipping in a mixture of shattered tonics and his own blood. "Travers!" Emmett Callahan, the other young gun, shouted, stepping forward from the back door. His voice cracked with panic. The old man didn't wait to admire his work. He knew the scattergun was now just 8 pounds of useless iron and wood. He dropped it quietly onto the floorboards. He was unarmed. His heavy Colt dragoons were still resting on the marble counter, a vast 10 feet away, guarded by the remaining 3 men. He needed a distraction, and he needed a weapon. From beneath the barber chair, Christian opened his eyes. The smoke was beginning to thin, drifting out through the shattered front window and the broken door. Through the haze, he saw the old man crouching low beside the copper boiler. It was the large cylindrical basin Christian used to keep the wet towel scalding hot for shaves. The old man looked directly at Christian. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. The pale blue eyes were as cold and calculating as a winter frost. The old man placed a single finger over his lips. Silence. Christian squeezed his eyes shut and jammed his hands over his ears, burying his face into his knees. He didn't want to watch. He didn't want to die. "He's empty," Rollins yelled, finally piecing the situation together. "A scattergun only holds 2. He's unarmed. Find him." Rollins thumbed back the hammer of his Colt, his eyes darting through the thinning smoke. He stepped over the groaning, thrashing form of Billy Travers without a second glance. "Galt, take the left," Rollins ordered. "Callahan, move up the right. He's hiding like a rat." The 3 men began to close the net. The barbershop was suddenly eerily quiet, save for the wet, shuddering sobs of Billy Travers in the corner. The thick black powder smoke had settled waist-high, leaving the upper half of the room relatively clear, but obscuring the floor where the old man was moving. Hiram Galt stepped carefully, his ivory-handled revolvers held out in front of him, his fingers twitching on the triggers. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting at every shadow. He moved past the leather strap hanging from the wall, creeping toward the back corner where the copper hot towel boiler stood. The old man was wedged in the tight space between the boiler and the wall. He had no gun, no knife, but he had a lifetime of violence to draw upon, and he knew that survival rarely belonged to the fastest draw. It belonged to the man who used everything at his disposal. He reached up slowly and wrapped his calloused hand around the heavy brass handle of the copper boiler lid. The metal was burning hot to the touch, but the old man didn't flinch. Galt took another step. He was close enough now that the old man could smell the stale chewing tobacco on his breath. Galt peered into the shadows behind the boiler. "I see," Galt started to say. The old man erupted from the floorboards. He didn't try to punch Galt or wrestle for the guns. Instead, he ripped the heavy brass lid off the boiler and, with a violent sweeping motion, hurled a blinding arc of scalding, boiling water directly into Hiram Galt's face. The water caught Galt full in the eyes and throat. The outlaw unleashed a blood-curdling shriek, a sound of pure agony that dwarfed Travers' crying. Galt dropped both of his fancy revolvers, his hands flying up to claw at his blistered, burning face. Before the revolvers even hit the floor, the old man lunged. He grabbed the heavy, scalding brass lid and slammed it brutally into the side of Galt's skull. There was a sickening crack, and Galt's knees buckled. The old man didn't let him fall. He grabbed Galt by the collar of his shirt, hauling the stunned, half-blinded man upright, pulling him tight against his chest. "Over there!" Emmett Callahan screamed from across the room. The young gunman brought his rifle up, pointing it at the scuffle. "Shoot him, Emmett!" Rollins barked from the center of the room, raising his own Colt. But Callahan hesitated. His hands were shaking. The old man had Galt pinned in a perfect bear hug, using the twitchy outlaw as a human shield. Only the old man's eyes were visible over Galt's shoulder, staring unblinking at the terrified boy. He's got Hiram, Mr. Rollins," Callahan stammered, lowering the rifle an inch. "I can't get a clear shot." "I said shoot, you gutless pup," Rollins roared. The old man whispered into Galt's ear, a harsh, rasping sound. "Tell the boy goodbye, Hiram." To force the issue, the old man violently shoved Galt forward, directly into Callahan's line of sight, while simultaneously diving to the left, putting a heavy oak supply cabinet between himself and Rollins. Callahan, operating on pure adrenaline and blind panic as a bloody, screaming man was suddenly thrown at him, reflexively squeezed the trigger of his Winchester. The rifle barked. A plume of smoke erupted from the barrel. Hiram Galt jerked violently as the heavy rifle slug caught him squarely in the chest. He let out a wet, rattling gasp and collapsed face first onto the wooden floorboards, dead before he stopped sliding. Callahan stared down at what he had done. He had just killed a member of his own gang. The rifle slipped from his trembling hands, clattering to the floor. I didn't," he whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "You stupid, useless bastard," Rollins hissed. Jeb Rollins didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply turned his Colt toward Emmett Callahan and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the young man in the throat. Callahan's hands flew up to his neck, his eyes bulging in absolute shock. He took one stumbling step backward, blood spilling through his fingers, and fell heavily against the back door, sliding down the wood to a lifeless heap. Rollins stood in the center of the barbershop, his chest heaving, the barrel of his Colt smoking. In the span of 60 seconds, his gang of 5 had been reduced to just him. Cletus was dead on the boardwalk. Travers was bleeding out in the corner. Galt and Callahan were dead by friendly fire and execution. Rollins' oily confidence was gone, replaced by a cold, desperate fury. He was dealing with a monster, a ghost who used men's own panic to destroy them. Just you and me now, old man," Rollins yelled into the silence of the shop, cocking the hammer of his Colt once more. "No more tricks. Step out." Christian, still curled beneath the barber chair, clamped a hand over his own mouth to stifle a sob. The sheer ruthlessness of Rollins executing his own man had broken Christian's mind. He squeezed his eyes tight, praying for the floor to open up and swallow him. The old man was crouched behind the oak supply cabinet, a mere 6 feet from the marble counter where his heavy Colt dragoons lay waiting. He was breathing harder now, the physical exertion of the last minute taxing his aging muscles. He wiped a streak of sweat from his forehead. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a human shield. He just had the space between the cabinet and the counter. "I'm waiting," Rollins bellowed, taking a slow, measured step toward the cabinet. "You killed my family. I'm going to watch you bleed out on this floor, and then I'm going to burn this whole town to the ground." The old man didn't answer. He closed his pale blue eyes for a single second, visualizing the room, visualizing the distance to the counter, visualizing Rollins' position. Then he opened them. It was time to finish the shave. Jeb Rollins took another step forward, his boots crunching loudly on the shattered glass of the medicine bottles. He held his Colt leveled, both hands wrapped around the grip to steady his aim. His knuckles were white. The sweat on his face mixed with the airborne soot, leaving dark streaks down his cheeks. "Come on out," Rollins taunted, though his voice lacked its previous swagger. There was a tremor in it now, the tremor of a man who realized he might not walk out of this room. Behind the oak cabinet, the old man coiled his legs beneath him. He knew he couldn't outrun a bullet. If he simply stood up and lunged for the counter, Rollins would put a .45 caliber slug through his spine before his hand even brushed the marble. He needed Rollins to flinch, just for a fraction of a second. The old man's hand brushed against something cold and sharp on the floorboards. He glanced down. It was Christian's bone-handled straight razor. The barber had dropped it when he dove for cover. The blade was still open, gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight, pushing through the smoke. The old man picked it up. The balance was perfect. He listened to Rollins' footsteps, crunch, crunch. He was close, just on the other side of the heavy oak wood. The old man took a deep breath, gripping the razor by its bone handle. With a sudden vicious flick of his wrist, he threw the open razor completely over the top of the tall cabinet. The spinning blade flashed through the air in a silver arc. Rollins, his nerves strung tight as barbed wire, reacted instantly to the sudden movement in his peripheral vision. Seeing a metallic flash hurtling toward him, he instinctively stepped back and fired a wild shot into the air at the flying object. The bullet missed the razor, burying itself into the ceiling joists. The razor clattered harmlessly against the far wall. It was a phantom threat, a split-second diversion, and it was all the old man needed. As Rollins' gun kicked upward from the recoil, the old man threw himself out from behind the cabinet. He didn't run. He dove low and flat, launching himself across the blood-slicked floorboards toward the marble counter. Rollins recovered instantly, cursing his own foolishness. He leveled the Colt and fanned the hammer, firing 2 rapid shots at the diving figure. Crack! Crack! The first bullet struck the floorboards inches from the old man's trailing boot, sending a spray of sharp wooden splinters into the air. The second bullet found its mark. It tore through the meaty part of the old man's left shoulder, ripping through the chambray shirt and exiting the back in a spray of crimson. The impact spun the old man in mid-air, throwing off his trajectory. He slammed hard into the base of the marble counter, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. "Got you, you son of a bitch!" Rollins screamed, a triumphant, ugly smile twisting his face. He walked forward, standing over the old man, aiming the barrel of his Colt directly at the man's chest. "Not so fast now, are you?" The old man was slumped against the counter, his left arm hanging useless at his side, blood pooling rapidly on the white tile floor. He was breathing heavily, his face pale, but his right arm wasn't resting. When he had slammed into the counter, the force of his body had jarred the heavy marble top. The shockwave vibrated through the stone, shifting the items resting on it, including the heavy oiled leather gun belt. As Rollins stood over him gloating, the old man didn't look up at the gun pointed at his heart. He looked at the edge of the counter, just above his head. With a final desperate surge of strength, the old man brought his right foot up and violently kicked the wooden side panel of the counter. The heavy piece of furniture shook. The gun belt, already precariously close to the edge, slid off the marble and plummeted downward. Rollins frowned, his eyes instinctively dropping to follow the falling object. It was a fatal error. The old man's right hand shot up like a striking viper. He caught the falling Colt Dragoon directly by the grip in mid-air. The gun was massive, weighing nearly 4.5 pounds, but in his hand, it looked as light as a feather. He didn't bother to lift it. He didn't try to stand. Resting his wrist on his bent knee, he cocked the heavy hammer and pulled the trigger in one fluid, impossibly fast motion. The roar of the heavy .44 caliber Dragoon in the enclosed space was a physical blow, deeper and more resonant than Rollins's Peacemaker. A massive jet of flame erupted from the muzzle. The heavy lead ball struck Jeb Rollins square in the center of his chest, right where the lapels of his dark frock coat met. The sheer kinetic force of the impact stopped Rollins dead in his tracks. His triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound, uncomprehending shock. He looked down at the smoking, bloody hole in his chest. His own gun slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Rollins opened his mouth to speak, to curse, to scream, but only a thick bubble of dark blood escaped his lips. His knees buckled, and he crashed backward, staring sightlessly up at the bullet-pocked tin ceiling. Silence, heavy and absolute, finally descended upon the Silver City Barbershop. The smoke began to clear in earnest now, drifting out into the sweltering August afternoon. The only sounds were the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of blood hitting the floorboards, and the ragged, shallow breathing of the old man slumped against the counter. Beneath the barber chair, Christian Vance slowly lowered his hands from his ears. He was shaking violently, his clothes soaked with sweat. He forced himself to peek around the iron base of the chair. The shop was a slaughterhouse. Broken glass, shattered tonics, splintered wood, and bodies lay strewn across the floor. Cletus McCoy was dead outside. Hiram Galt and Emmett Callahan lay in pools of blood near the back. Jeb Rollins was a lifeless heap in the center of the room. Only Billy Travers remained alive, whimpering softly in the corner, clutching his ruined legs in deep shock. Christian's wide, terrified eyes finally settled on the old man. The nameless gunman was still sitting on the floor, leaning against the counter. His left arm was soaked in blood from the shoulder wound. He held the smoking Colt Dragoon loosely in his right hand, resting on his knee. He looked exhausted. Every one of his years suddenly showed on his lined, leathery face. The old man turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes finding Christian cowering under the chair. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The old man just looked at the barber, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, painfully, the old man reached up with his right hand and wiped a smear of drying shaving lather off his jawline. He looked at his fingers, then looked back at Christian. "You missed a spot," the old man rasped, his voice barely a whisper. The silence inside Christian Vance's barbershop was heavier than the August heat. The gunfire had stopped, but the echoes still rang in Christian's skull, a high-pitched whine that made his teeth ache. The acrid cloud of black powder smoke was finally being pulled out into the street by a sluggish afternoon breeze, revealing the full extent of the devastation. Christian remained frozen beneath the barber chair for a long moment, staring at the nameless old man slumped against the bullet-scarred marble counter. The old man's joke about missing a spot hung in the air, a surreal punctuation mark to a bloodbath. "Sir!" Christian finally choked out, his voice barely a squeak. The old man didn't look up. He was busy using his good right hand to unbutton his blood-soaked chambray shirt. "Whiskey, barber, and a clean towel, not one of the hot ones. Find something dry." Christian scrambled out from under the chair, his boots slipping momentarily on the wet floorboards. He deliberately kept his eyes averted from the lifeless form of Jeb Rollins lying in the center of the room. The stench of voided bowels, copper-scented blood, and sulfur was overpowering. In the far corner, young Billy Travers had stopped screaming and was now reduced to a rhythmic, wet whimpering, clutching his shattered legs. Christian moved to his back cabinet, his hands shaking so violently he knocked over 3 bottles of witch hazel before finding his hidden stash of Kentucky bourbon. He grabbed a fresh linen towel from the stack and hurried back to the old man. The gunslinger had managed to pull his shirt down, revealing a lean, muscular torso heavily cross-hatched with the pale silver lines of old knife scars and the puckered craters of previous bullet wounds. The new wound was ugly. A clean, through-and-through puncture just below the left collarbone. It was bleeding sluggishly, the dark red pooling against his collar. "Pour," the old man commanded, tilting his head back against the marble counter. Christian uncorked the bottle with his teeth and poured the amber liquid directly into the open wound. The old man didn't scream. His jaw clamped shut, the muscles in his neck standing out like steel cables. A low, ragged hiss escaped his lips, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the counter, but he didn't move away. "Now bind it, tight." As Christian awkwardly wrapped the linen towel over the old man's shoulder, securing it with trembling fingers, a shadow fell across the shattered threshold of the barbershop. "Mother of God!" a voice breathed. Christian looked up. Standing in the doorway, stepping carefully over the ruined door and the body of Cletus McCoy, was Josiah Cobb, the Silver City sheriff. Cobb was a portly man who wore his tin star more as a social status symbol than a badge of duty. He held a double-barreled shotgun loosely in his hands, his face the color of old parchment as he surveyed the carnage. Behind him, a crowd of townspeople had begun to gather on the boardwalk, craning their necks to look inside. Their faces masks of morbid curiosity and terror. Sheriff Cobb's eyes tracked from the bodies of Galt and Callahan to the bloody heap of Jeb Rollins, and finally rested on the old man bleeding against the counter. Cobb swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "You," Cobb stammered, raising the shotgun an inch. "You killed Jeb Rollins." "Jeb Rollins was careless," the old man rasped, his voice raw. He didn't bother to look at the sheriff's gun. He was focused on adjusting the makeshift bandage. "I heard the shooting," Cobb said defensively, as if justifying his late arrival. "I was down at the telegraph office. By the time I got my scattergun—" "By the time you found your courage, the work was done," the old man finished for him. He looked up, locking his pale blue eyes on the sheriff. "Relax your grip on that greener, Josiah. If I wanted to kill the law, I'd have started with you." Cobb flinched at the use of his first name. He lowered the shotgun slightly. "Who are you, mister? You ride into my town, turn a place of business into an abattoir, and gun down 5 men. 4, the old man corrected, nodding his head toward the whimpering boy in the corner. "The pup's still breathing, barely. Better fetch your doc before he bleeds out into the barber's floorboards." Cobb didn't move. He was squinting at the old man's weathered face, a flicker of recognition fighting its way through his shock. He looked at the heavy Colt Dragoon resting on the old man's knee, then at the matched pair still lying on the floor where they had fallen. "I know you," Cobb whispered, the color draining further from his face. "I saw a tintype of you once, years ago, down in Austin. You rode with Major John B. Jones in the Frontier Battalion back in '74. The old man's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "You're Elias Gentry," Cobb said, the name tumbling out of his mouth like a curse. A murmur rippled through the crowd gathered outside. Even Christian, whose knowledge of Western lore was limited, felt a chill run down his spine. Elias Gentry was a ghost story whispered around campfires. A former Texas Ranger turned bounty hunter, a man supposedly so cold-blooded he once tracked a gang into the Sierra Madres and came back with nothing but their scalps and their boots. "Gentry died in a fire in Dodge City 5 years ago," the old man said flatly. "No," Cobb said, shaking his head. "He just burned the saloon down and walked away into the smoke. It's you, I swear it." Gentry sighed, the effort causing a fresh bloom of red to appear on the white linen bandage. "If you know who I am, Sheriff, then you know this isn't murder. It's pest control. Jeb Rollins had paper on him from the territorial governor, dead or alive. $2,000. You came here to collect a bounty?" Christian asked, his voice shaking. He looked around his destroyed livelihood. "You knew they would follow you here?" "I knew Rollins was vain," Gentry said, looking at the barber. "I killed his cousin Eli in Tombstone 3 months ago. Eli was a rabid dog who liked hurting women. I put him down. I made sure word got back to Jeb. I knew his pride wouldn't let it go. So you used my shop as a slaughterhouse? Christian's fear was suddenly eclipsed by a flash of righteous anger. You endangered me? You endangered this whole town? Gentry looked at Christian, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something resembling regret in his pale eyes. I used the terrain, son, Gentry said quietly. If I faced them in the street, innocent people walking the boardwalk would have caught stray lead. In here. It was contained. You were safe under that chair. I made sure of it. Doc Miller, a perpetually harried man smelling of laudanum and peppermint, pushed his way through the crowd 10 minutes later. He ignored the dead man and immediately knelt beside Billy Travers. The young outlaw was pale as milk, his breathing shallow. He needs to be moved to my clinic now, Miller barked at Sheriff Cobb. Get some men in here to carry him. As two brave volunteers hauled the screaming Travers out the door, the doctor turned his attention to Gentry. I'll patch that shoulder for you, Mr. Gentry, Miller said cautiously, keeping his distance, but I'll need you on my table. No time, Gentry grunted. He reached out with his right hand and grabbed the heavy edge of the marble counter. With a massive heave of effort, his boots slipping momentarily in a puddle of blood, the old man pushed himself to his feet. He swayed dangerously for a second, his face turning an ashen gray, but he locked his knees and found his balance. He towered over the room, the bloodied linen stark against his pale skin. The bleeding slowed, Gentry said, dismissing the doctor. He looked at Christian. Barber, come here. Christian swallowed his fear and stepped cautiously over the shattered glass and debris to stand before the towering gunslinger. Gentry reached into his remaining front pocket with his bloody right hand. He pulled out a heavy leather drawstring pouch and tossed it onto the marble counter. It landed with a heavy metallic clink. For the window, Gentry said, his voice a low gravel rumble. For the mirror, for the floorboards, and for the shave. Christian stared at the pouch. I don't want your blood money. It's gold, Gentry said simply. Mined out of the Black Hills, pure and heavy. Take it, rebuild, or buy a ticket back east. This territory isn't for men who shake when they hold a razor. The candor of the statement stung Christian, but he knew it was the absolute truth. He had come west, hoping for a fresh start, but all he had found was dust, disease, and death. He reached out and touched the leather pouch. It was heavy enough to buy a dozen barbershops. Why me? Christian asked, looking up into Gentry's eyes. Why did you come to my shop to wait for them? Because you keep your razors sharp, Christian, Gentry said, and because a man shouldn't meet his maker looking unkempt. Gentry turned away from the counter. He walked slowly toward where his two heavy Colt dragoons lay on the floorboards. He bent at the knees, keeping his wounded shoulders stiff, and scooped them up. He checked the cylinders methodically, blowing a speck of dust off one of the hammers, before sliding them smoothly into the oiled leather holsters, hanging from the gun belt he had kicked to the floor. He slung the heavy gun belt over his good shoulder, rather than buckling it around his waist. He picked up his dusty duster from where it had fallen, draping it over his wounded side to hide the blood. Sheriff Cobb stood by the doorway, still clutching his shotgun, blocking the exit. You can't just leave, Gentry, Cobb said, trying to summon a tone of authority. There's an inquest. There's paperwork. There's the matter of the bounty. Gentry paused, turning his head slowly to look at the sheriff. Josiah, Gentry said softly, you have 5 dead outlaws in your town. The telegram you send to the governor is going to make you look like a hero. You're going to tell him that Sheriff Josiah Cobb bravely defended Silver City from the notorious Rollins gang. You'll keep the bounty for yourself. You'll probably get re-elected. Cobb blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. But if you try to make me stay in this room for 1 more minute, Gentry continued, the icy menace returning to his voice, I will take that greener from your hands, and I will beat you to death with it in front of your voters. Do we have an understanding? Cobb looked into the pale blue eyes and saw the absolute and terrifying truth of the threat. The sheriff slowly lowered the shotgun and took a wide step backward, clearing the doorway. The collective breath of Silver City seemed suspended in the shimmering, superheated air of that August afternoon. Every soul on the boardwalk, from the sweating merchant standing outside the general store to the jittery townsfolk peering through cracked open shutters, remained dead silent. They parted like the Red Sea as Elias Gentry stepped out of the ruined, blood-spattered threshold of Christian Vance's barbershop and into the glaring, unforgiving sun. He did not swagger or play to the gallery, for vanity was a luxury reserved for men who did not bleed. Instead, he moved with the slow, deliberate, agonizingly calculated gait of an aging apex predator who had survived yet another violent collision with history. His heavy boots crunched rhythmically on the glittering carpet of shattered plate glass that littered the boardwalk. Tied securely to the hitching post outside the Mercantile across the dusty thoroughfare stood a massive, heavily scarred roan stallion. The animal possessed the same dour, weather-beaten resilience as its master, its ears flicking back and forth as it caught the heavy, coppery scent of the carnage drifting across the street from the open doors of the barbershop. Gentry crossed the dusty road, his left arm held stiffly against his side, shielding the crude, blood-soaked linen bandage wrapped tightly around his shoulder. Every step sent white-hot lances of fire radiating across his chest, but his face remained a carved mask of stoic endurance. He reached the roan, untied the reins with his steady right hand, and gathered them into his palm. With a deep, controlled breath that hitched only slightly at the peak, Gentry hauled himself up into the heavy saddle. The leather creaked under his weight. The stallion shifted uneasily, snorting a plume of dust into the air before settling into a disciplined stance. Sitting tall and silhouetted against the blinding horizon of the New Mexico desert, Gentry allowed his pale blue eyes to sweep slowly across the town he had just rewritten. He looked at Sheriff Josiah Cobb, who stood frozen near the barbershop, still glistening with nervous sweat and clutching his shotgun like a talisman against reality. He looked at the bodies of the Rollins gang, which were already drawing a hazy cloud of desert flies in the oppressive heat. Finally, Gentry's gaze locked onto the doorway of the shop. There stood Christian Vance. The barber looked smaller now, stripped of his civilized Philadelphia pretensions, standing amidst the wreckage of his shattered livelihood. His white apron was stained with gunpowder and blood, his hands still trembling slightly at his sides. The old gunslinger did not offer a grand speech. There were no melodramatic declarations of heroism or vengeance fulfilled. Instead, Gentry simply raised his right hand, touched 2 fingers to the brim of his low-crowned Stetson, and tipped it slightly. It was a gesture born of mutual respect between 2 men who had shared an extraordinarily violent moment in time. It was a silent acknowledgement that Christian had kept his nerve when the world had literally exploded around him. Then, with a gentle shift of his weight and a subtle cue of the reins, Elias Gentry turned the roan stallion toward the open expanse of the desert. He did not spur the animal into a frantic gallop. He let the horse walk at a steady, ground-eating pace, leaving the town behind with the same quiet inevitability with which he had arrived. Christian watched him go. He watched as the tall, stooped figure in the dust-covered duster grew smaller and smaller against the shimmering landscape. He watched until the horse and rider blurred into the copper-tinted heat haze, swallowed whole by the vast, indifferent wilderness that defined the frontier. When the horizon was empty once more, Christian turned slowly back toward the interior of his shop. The air inside was still thick with the haunting aromas of gun smoke, burnt powder, and death. He walked past the lifeless form of Jeb Rollins, stepping carefully over a widening pool of dark blood that had soaked deep into the unyielding pine floorboards. He moved to the back counter where the heavy leather pouch of gold coins sat alongside his discarded Sheffield steel razor. Christian picked up the pouch, feeling its dense, reassuring weight in his palm. Then he reached down and retrieved the razor, opening the bone handle to inspect the blade. It was still sharp, perfectly balanced and unmarred by the chaos. He wiped the steel clean against his apron and caught his own reflection in a jagged fragment of the silver mirror still clinging to the wall. He did not see the naive Eastern immigrant who had stepped off the stagecoach 2 years ago, hoping to heal a broken heart in the dry desert air. The face staring back at him was harder, lined with the hard truths of survival, carved by the realization that sometimes violence was the only language the frontier truly understood. Christian snapped the razor shut with a crisp, definitive click and slipped it into his pocket. He did not yet know whether he would use the gold to sweep away the broken glass, hammer new timbers into the walls, and rebuild his life right here in Silver City, or if he would pack a single bag and catch the next eastbound train back to the safety of Pennsylvania. But as he looked out one last time at the sun-baked street where legends were born and buried in the dust, Christian knew one thing with absolute, unshakable certainty. He would never look at a quiet afternoon, a shaving mug, or a stranger walking through his door the same way again. The ghosts of the West had claimed a piece of his soul, and there was no going back. Elias Gentry rode away a legend, leaving a town changed and a barber with a heavy choice. The Wild West wasn't just a place of cinematic shootouts. It was a brutal landscape where survival often meant shedding one's innocence in the blink of an eye. Blood was the currency, and iron was the law. If this intense tale of grit, survival, and vengeance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more immersive historical dramas. What do you think Christian Vance did next? Did he use the gold to rebuild his shop and stay in the West, or did he pack his bags and run back to the safety of Philadelphia? Let me know in the comments below.